Watuan, Soledad Prison. September 1968. The California sun beats down on cracked concrete, turning the exercise yard into a furnace. 200 inmates move in careful choreography, each step calculated, each glance loaded with meaning. And here, respect isn't given. It's taken. Or it's stolen. But this won't be just another prison killing. This murder, committed in broad daylight, witnessed by dozens, will ignite a war that has burned for 60 years. A war between brothers. A war that has claimed thousands of lives, filled California's prisons with blood, and transformed street corners from Bakersfield to the Oregon border into battlegrounds. They call themselves Nuestra Familia, our family. But to understand how a stolen pair of boots became the spark for California's longest and deadliest prison war, we need to go back further. Back to the fields, back to the brachero camps, back to when being called a farm boy wasn't just an insult, it was a death sentence. This is American gang war, and this is the story of how humiliation became honor, and family became the most dangerous word in the California prison system. To understand Nuestra Familia, you first have to understand California itself, a state split down the middle by more than geography. By 1965, California's prison system was bursting at the seams. San Quentin, Folsom, Soledad, dual vocational institution. These weren't just prisons. They were pressure cookers, holding thousands of young Mexican-American men from two very different worlds. In Southern California, Los Angeles, East LA, San Diego, street culture had already taken root. The Pachucos, the Zoot Suiters, young Chicanos who grew up in urban barrios, speaking a mix of Spanish and English, influenced by black and white street gangs, creating their own identity in the asphalt jungles of post-war America. They wore khakis and Pendletons. They spoke Calo, a street slang that mixed Spanish, English, and Aztec words. They called themselves Sureños, Southerners. And they had pride, fierce territorial pride in their neighborhoods, their cliques, their way of life. But Northern California was different. The Central Valley, Fresno, Stockton, Salinas, San Jose. This was agricultural country, where Mexican-American families had worked the fields for generations, picking grapes, lettuce, strawberries. Many had come through the brachero program, that controversial guest worker initiative that brought hundreds of thousands of Mexican laborers to California between 1942 and 1964. These were rural communities, traditional, more connected to their Mexican roots. They spoke Spanish at home, worked sunrise to sunset, lived in migrant camps and small farming towns that most Californians never saw. And when young men from these two worlds ended up in the same prison yard, the culture clash was immediate and brutal. In 1957, at Duell Vocational Institution in Tracy, California, a group of 13 young Chicanos from East Los Angeles and the San Gabriel Valley formed an alliance. They were tired of being victimized by white and black prison gangs. They wanted protection, power, respect. They called themselves La M, the letter M in Spanish, the Mexican Mafia. Luis Huero Buff Flores, Joe Pegleg Morgan, a white guy from East LA who was more Mexican than most Mexicans. Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena, a fierce fighter who would become one of La M's most feared enforcers. These weren't just gangsters. They were organizers, strategists. They created a structure, a code, a blood oath. Once you were made, jumped into La M, you were in for life. The only way out was death. By the mid-1960s, The Mexican Mafia controlled drug trafficking, gambling, and protection rackets in most California prisons. If you were a Mexican inmate and you wanted to do business, you paid taxes to La M. If you didn't, you got checked, beaten, stabbed, or worse. And if you were from Northern California, the farm boys, the migrant workers, you were considered soft, weak, not really Mexica. Imagine being 18 years old, sentenced to 5 years for a drug charge or robbery, walking into Soledad or Folsom for the first time. You're from Salinas, maybe, or Fresno. Your family picks strawberries. You speak Spanish at home, English at school. You think, okay, I'm Mexican. I'll connect with other Mexicans. But that's not what happens. The Southern Mexicans, the Sureños, look at you different. They hear your accent. They ask where you're from. And when you say Fresno or San Jose or Stockton, the temperature drops. They call you farmero, buster. They mock the way you speak Spanish. Too proper, too Mexican, and not street enough. They tell you you're not Chicano. You're not one of them. And then comes the tax La M demanded tribute from all Mexican inmates. Money, commissary items, cigarettes, drugs if you had them. The Southerners paid willingly. It was protection. It was belonging. But the Northerners? They balked. Why should they pay taxes to gangsters from LA? They weren't in their neighborhoods. This wasn't their culture. These weren't their people. And refusing to pay La M wasn't just defiance. It was disrespect. And disrespect in prison is a debt paid in blood. Late summer, 1968, Soledad State Prison, Central California. The details have become legend, passed down through decades, modified and mythologized. But the core truth remains. What happened that day changed everything. An inmate named Shooter Padilla, a Norteño from the Central Valley, had a pair of boots. Now this might seem trivial to someone on the outside, but in prison, possessions take on outsized importance. A good pair of boots might take months to acquire through commissary, through trades, through careful saving. Their currency, their status. A Southern inmate connected to La M decided he wanted those boots. Words were exchanged. Maybe it started as a request, a demand dressed up in the language of respect. But the message was clear. Hand them over. When Padilla refused, the boots were taken by force. For the Northerners, this wasn't just theft. This was the final humiliation in a long series of humiliations. The mocking, the taxes, the disrespect, and now, outright robbery. A Northern inmate named Antonio Tony Esquivel decided enough was enough. What happened next depends on who's telling the story. Some say Esquivel confronted the thief directly, demanding the boots back. Others say it was planned, a calculated strike to send a message. But everyone agrees on one thing. Esquivel had a shank. Crude, handmade, probably a piece of metal sharpened on concrete, wrapped with tape or cloth for grip. One thrust, maybe more. The Southern inmate went down in the dirt, blood pooling beneath him. Guards swarmed the yard. Esquivel didn't run. He stood there, weapon still in hand, as they took him down and dragged him away. That killing over a stolen pair of shoes lit a fuse that has been burning for 60 years. When word reached the Mexican Mafia, the response was immediate. You don't kill a Sureño and walk away. You don't disrespect La M without consequences. They issued a green light, a kill-on-sight order, for Esquivel and anyone who stood with him. But something unexpected happened. Instead of cowering, instead of begging for mercy, the northern inmates unified. If La M wanted war, they'd get war. Locked in segregation units, the whole SHU, administrative segregation. Northern inmates began to organize. They couldn't meet face to face, so they communicated through kites. Tiny folded notes passed from cell to cell through plumbing, under doors, via trustees. 4 men emerged as leaders. Their names would become legend in California's prison system. Antonio Esquivel, the man who'd committed the original killing. Freddy Gonzalez, Raymond Huero Shryock, and Robert Babo Sosa. These men weren't career criminals or hardened killers when they entered prison, but circumstance and the need for survival forged them into something else. They drafted a constitution, rules, a code of conduct, and they gave themselves a name. Nuestra Familia, our family. Not La Familia, the family, but Nuestra, ours, collective. Bound by something deeper than blood, bound by choice, by necessity, by the shared experience of humiliation, and the refusal to accept it any longer. The oath was simple but absolute. Loyalty to the North. Death before dishonor. Respect the cause above all else. If you join Nuestra Familia, you're in for life. You don't retire. You don't quit. The only way out is death. Yours or the organization's. Some accounts say the oath was sealed with blood, each founding member pricking his finger and pressing it to paper. Others say it was sealed with violence. Each man had to prove himself worthy through action. Either way, by early 1969, Nuestra Familia was official. And California's prisons would never be the same. Once Nuestra Familia declared itself, there was no neutral ground. Every Mexican inmate in California's prison system had to choose North or South, red or blue, La Familia or La M, and choosing wrong could get you killed. 1969 through 1975, these were the bloodiest years. California's prisons became war zones. Inmates manufactured weapons with terrifying ingenuity. Shanks carved from the metal frames of bunk beds. Razors melted into toothbrush handles. Sharpened pieces of plexiglass that could slice through flesh like butter. Padlocks stuffed into socks. Crude but devastating clubs. The violence followed patterns. A norteño would be jumped by sureños in the shower. Days later, a sureño would be stabbed in the chow hall. Retaliation. Counter-retaliation. Blood for blood. Prison officials tried everything. Separate yards. Separate cell blocks. Constant lockdowns that kept inmates in their cells 23 hours a day. But you can't segregate an entire prison system. Eventually, North and South would cross paths. In the yard, in the corridors, in the law library. And when they did, violence erupted. Guards started finding bodies in the most unexpected places. A sureño strangled in his cell, his bunkmate, a norteño, claiming he'd been asleep and heard nothing. A norteño found beaten to death in a blind spot on the yard. Dozens of witnesses, who all suddenly went blind and deaf. The code was absolute. You don't snitch. You handle your business. The guards are the enemy, not the referee. While the violence raged, Nuestra Familia's leadership was building something more sophisticated than a simple prison gang. They were creating an organization with structure, hierarchy, and a written code of conduct. The Nuestra Familia Constitution, written on scraps of paper, hidden in hollowed-out book spines, smuggled out in legal mail, laid out the rules that would govern the organization for decades. Article 1. The organization shall be known as Nuestra Familia, and its members shall be dedicated to the cause of Northern California Chicano inmates. Article 2. All members must take a blood oath and understand that membership is for life. Article 3. The organization shall maintain a military-style structure with generals, captains, lieutenants, and soldiers. Article 4. Any member who cooperates with law enforcement, shows cowardice, or betrays the family in any way shall be subject to immediate execution. These weren't just rules. They were a manifesto. Nuestra Familia was positioning itself not as a gang, but as a revolutionary organization, fighting for the dignity and protection of Northern California Chicanos. They drew inspiration from the Chicano movement happening outside prison walls, the farm workers' strikes led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, the Brown Berets organizing against police brutality, the Chicano moratorium protesting the Vietnam War. Inside the walls, Nuestra Familia framed themselves as freedom fighters, resistance to the oppression of La M and the prison system itself. But make no mistake, this was also about power, about control, about building an empire that could compete with the Mexican Mafia's dominance. As Nuestra Familia grew, leadership consolidated around a core group of generals, men whose names would become synonymous with the organization. Robert Babo Sosa, one of the founding members, known for his intelligence and strategic thinking. He helped draft much of the Constitution and maintained discipline among the ranks. Freddy Gonzalez, charismatic and ruthless, able to inspire loyalty while enforcing the blood oath with brutal efficiency. Raymond Huero Shryock, a rare Anglo member of Nuestra Familia, accepted because he'd grown up in the fields of Northern California and had proven his loyalty beyond question. But perhaps the most feared NF general was a man who wouldn't emerge until later. Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena. Wait, didn't we mention that name before? As a Mexican Mafia member? This is where the story gets complicated and bloody. Cadena had indeed been a Mexican Mafia member, one of its most respected fighters. But Cadena was from the San Gabriel Valley, Southern California, yes, but not the urban core of East LA. And as La M became more rigid, more demanding, more brutal in its taxation and control, Cadena began to see the organization differently. When he was transferred to Chino in the early 1970s, Cadena made a decision that shocked the California prison system. He flipped. He renounced La M and joined Nuestra Familia. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was heresy. You don't leave the Mexican Mafia. The oath is blood in, blood out. The only exit is death. But Cadena was too powerful, too respected, too dangerous to simply assassinate. His defection gave Nuestra Familia a massive boost in credibility and tactical knowledge. He knew how La M operated from the inside. He knew their weaknesses, their strategies, their members. For La M, Cadena's betrayal was an open wound that demanded closure. They would hunt him for years, waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity. That moment would come. And when it did, the violence would reach a new level entirely. As members of Nuestra Familia were transferred between California's prisons, from Soledad to Folsom, from San Quentin to Corcoran, the organization spread. Each new prison yard became contested territory. And here's where things get more complex. Unlike the Mexican Mafia, which remained strictly a prison organization in its early years, Nuestra Familia quickly understood the power of the streets. When northern inmates paroled out, released after serving their time, they carried the code with them. Back to Fresno, back to Salinas, back to San Jose and Stockton, and they began recruiting on the streets. Young Chicanos in Northern California, facing poverty, discrimination, and limited opportunities, found something appealing in Nuestra Familia's message: pride, protection, purpose, a family that would never abandon you. Street gangs started flying the red bandana, the color of the North. They tagged "14" on walls, 14 for the 14th letter of the alphabet, N for Norteño. These weren't official Nuestra Familia members. The organization maintained strict standards for full membership, requiring years of proving yourself, often including prison time. But these street soldiers became the foot soldiers of a growing empire. They sold drugs and sent a percentage of profits back to NF leadership in prison. They collected taxes from independent dealers who wanted to operate in Northern Territory. They carried out hits on Sureños, Southern California gang members, continuing the war on city streets. By 1975, Nuestra Familia had evolved from a prison protection group into something far more dangerous, a criminal enterprise with tentacles reaching throughout Northern California. And law enforcement was only beginning to understand what they were dealing with. December 1975, Folsom State Prison, one of California's oldest and most notorious institutions. For 2 weeks, prison officials had been receiving intelligence about a planned mass assault between Norteños and Sureños. The yard was powder keg. Tension crackled in the air like electricity before storm. Guards increased patrols. Shakedowns became more frequent. Suspected weapons were confiscated. But for every shank found, 3 more remained hidden. On December 19th, during afternoon yard time, it happened. Over 60 inmates, split between North and South, erupted into warfare. Shanks appeared as if by magic, pulled from hiding spots guards would later marvel at, sewn into the seams of jackets, hidden in the spines of books, buried in the dirt, and dug up moments before the assault. The fight lasted 7 minutes before guards regained control using tear gas and warning shots. When the smoke cleared, 4 inmates lay dead. 17 more were critically wounded. The Folsom lockdown that followed lasted 6 months. Every inmate confined to their cell. No yard time, no contact. Prison officials conducted the most extensive shakedown in California history, stripping cells down to bare walls, searching every crack and crevice. They found an arsenal, over 200 weapons, ranging from crude shanks to sophisticated blades that must have taken months to create. They found kites, coded messages, outlining the hits that had been planned, the targets, the justifications. And they found something else, evidence that Nuestra Familia and the Mexican Mafia weren't just prison gangs anymore. They were organized crime syndicates with influence reaching far beyond the walls. The Folsom lockdown was a wake-up call. Law enforcement agencies across California began coordinating. The FBI opened investigations. Task forces were formed, but they were years behind. The war was already raging, and it was about to explode onto the streets in ways no one could have predicted. Salinas, California, early 1980s, the Steinbeck country, lettuce capital of the world, agricultural hub of the Central Coast. But beneath the fields and canneries, a shadow economy was growing. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and Nuestra Familia wanted their cut. Here's how the tax worked. If you wanted to sell drugs in Northern California territory, and that meant anywhere north of Bakersfield, you paid tribute to Nuestra Familia. Usually 10 to 20% of your profits, sometimes more. The money flowed up through a sophisticated network. Street soldiers collected from independent dealers. They passed the cash to lieutenants. Lieutenants gave it to captains. And captains smuggled it into prisons through corrupt guards, through visitors, through elaborate schemes involving legal mail. This wasn't just about money. It was about control, about establishing an empire that transcended prison walls. If you refused to pay, you got a warning, maybe a beating. Your product stolen, your operation shut down. If you still refused, if you showed disrespect, you got a green light. Orders came from inside prison. A general would send a kite to a captain on the streets. The message would be simple. Handle the problem with Juan Rodriguez. Or, that issue in Stockton needs to be resolved. Everyone understood what that meant. Within days, sometimes hours, the target would be found, shot in his car, stabbed in an alley. Sometimes his body would be left in public view as a message. Sometimes it would disappear entirely, never to be found. December 1972. Palm Hall Yard at Chino State Prison. Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena, the Mexican Mafia member who defected to Nuestra Familia, was lifting weights when 4 EMA soldiers surrounded him. This wasn't a random attack. This was an execution. Planned. Coordinated. Approved at the highest levels of La M. Cadena fought. Witnesses say he took 2 of his attackers down before the blades found him. One thrust to the chest, another to the throat. The weight bar fell with a clang as Cadena collapsed onto the concrete. He died there, on that prison yard, bleeding out while guards sounded alarms and inmates scattered. For the Mexican Mafia, it was justice. You don't betray La M and live. For Nuestra Familia, it was a declaration of war. Within weeks, the retaliation began. EMA members were targeted throughout the California prison system. The violence escalated to levels that shocked even veteran corrections officers. But Cadena's death also revealed something crucial. Neither organization was invincible. Leadership could be touched. Generals could die. And if generals could die, no one was safe. By 1989, law enforcement had had enough. The violence was spilling over into communities. Innocent people were getting caught in crossfire. Families were being terrorized. The FBI, in coordination with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, California Department of Justice, and local law enforcement, launched Operation Black Widow, one of the most extensive gang investigations in American history. Undercover agents infiltrated Norteño street gangs. Informants, often former members threatened with life sentences, were turned and sent back in wearing wires. Every phone call, every meeting, every transaction was monitored. What they discovered shocked them. Nuestra Familia wasn't just a gang. It was a sophisticated criminal organization with military-style structure, detailed record-keeping, and a communication system that rivaled legitimate corporations. Generals in prison sent directives to captains on the streets through coded letters. "Tell Grandma I miss her cooking" meant increased drug shipments. "Uncle needs medicine" meant someone required protection. "The car needs repair" meant execute a hit. They found ledgers tracking drug profits down to the dollar. They found lists of taxpayers, dealers required to pay tribute. They found hit lists with names, addresses, and detailed descriptions of targets. And they found something else, evidence of corruption within the prison system itself. Guards smuggling drugs, staff passing messages, corrections officers on Nuestra Familia's payroll. Over the next decade, Operation Black Widow would result in hundreds of arrests. But the first major takedown came in the spring of 2001. Simultaneous raids across Northern California, Salinas, San Jose, Sacramento, Modesto. Federal agents, SWAT teams, local police, hitting houses at dawn. They arrested 21 high-ranking Nuestra Familia members in a single day, including Generals Cornelio Cuede, Tristan, and James Tibbs Morales. 13 were indicted under RICO, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, facing life sentences without parole. In court, prosecutors laid out the case. Nuestra Familia was a criminal enterprise responsible for dozens of murders, drug trafficking worth tens of millions of dollars, extortion, witness intimidation, and racketeering. They played wiretap recordings of generals ordering hits from prison phones. They showed kites seized during prison shakedowns, detailed orders written in elaborate codes. They brought forward witnesses, former members who testified about the blood oath, the Constitution, the structure. One witness, a former captain who'd spent 15 years in Nuestra Familia, described the organization's reach. They controlled everything north of Bakersfield, every drug dealer, every gang, every hustle. If you were Chicano in Northern California, you either paid the tax or you disappeared. And it all ran through prison. The generals inside pulled all the strings. They had more power locked up than most people have free. After the mass arrests, corrections officials faced a dilemma. You can't just throw Nuestra Familia generals into general population. They'd continue running operations. From inside, they'd done it before. So California Department of Corrections created something new. The Security Housing Unit. SAU, Pelican Bay's most restrictive facility. Imagine concrete cell, 8 by 10 feet. A concrete slab for a bed. A steel toilet. A narrow window that lets in light but shows nothing of the outside world. 23 hours a day in that cell. 1 hour in a concrete recreation pen. Alone, under constant surveillance. No contact with other inmates except through walls. Meals delivered through a slot. Mail monitored. Phone calls, if allowed at all. Recorded and subject to termination at any moment. This was meant to break them. To cut off communication. To end their influence. It didn't work. Nuestra Familia generals adapted. They developed more sophisticated codes. They used legal mail, protected by attorney-client privilege, to send messages. They trained younger inmates to memorize entire documents that could be recited to others once transferred. And when all else failed, they used the oldest method. Word of mouth, whispered through walls, passed in corridors. During the brief moments when prisoners moved between facilities. You can isolate a man's body, but you can't isolate his influence if others believe in the cause. Salinas, 2010s. A teenager, we'll call him Miguel, though that's not his real name, is 15 years old when he's first approached. He lives with his grandmother in Alisal, Salinas's East Side neighborhood. His father's in prison for drug possession. His mother left when he was 6. He attends school sporadically, mostly because the courts mandate it, not because he sees much point. One afternoon after school, some older guys, maybe 18, 19, stop him on the corner. "Where you from, little homie?" Miguel knows what this means. In Northern California, that question isn't casual conversation. It's a test. "I'm from here," he says. "Salinas." Norte or scrap? Norte, Northern California. Or scrap, a derogatory term for Southern California gang members. There's no neutral answer. There's no, "I'm not in a gang." Because in some neighborhoods, simply living there makes you a target for one side or the other. Miguel says he's Norte. It's the expected answer. The safe answer. And just like that, he's on a path. The older guys start bringing him around. Small things at first. "Hold this package. Deliver this message. Stand on this corner and let us know if you see cops." They give him money. More than he's ever had. They give him respect. Call him youngster, little soldier. They tell him he's part of something bigger. A family, a cause, a brotherhood that goes back generations. This is how it happens. Not with force, not usually. With belonging, with purpose, with the promise that someone has your back. For kids like Miguel, growing up in communities where opportunities are scarce, where schools are underfunded, where fathers are absent and futures seem predetermined, gang membership offers what legitimate society doesn't: identity, protection, a sense of mattering. And Nuestra Familia is particularly good at this recruitment. They don't just offer gang membership. They offer ideology, history, a narrative of resistance against oppression. Despite decades of law enforcement pressure, Nuestra Familia has proven remarkably resilient. The structure has evolved, but the core remains. At the top, the generals, men serving life sentences in maximum security, often in isolation units. Yet they remain the ultimate authority. Every major decision, who gets made, who gets greenlit, how territories are divided, flows through them. Below the generals, the captains, some in prison, some on the streets. They're the middle management, translating the generals' directives into action, overseeing regional operations, collecting and distributing money. Then the lieutenants, regional coordinators who manage specific territories, a city, a neighborhood, sometimes just a few blocks. They recruit, they discipline, they ensure the tax is collected. At the bottom, the soldados and associates, street soldiers, young men, and increasingly young women, who do the daily work, sell the drugs, collect the debts, carry out the violence when ordered. But here's what makes Nuestra Familia different from many street gangs: the discipline, the structure, the long-term thinking. Street gangs often operate impulsively. Personal beefs, emotional reactions, quick money. Nuestra Familia operates like a corporation, a violent, criminal corporation, but one with strategic planning, hierarchical accountability, and generational thinking. When a captain orders a hit, it's not personal, it's business. When taxes are collected, detailed records are kept. When money flows into prison, it's distributed according to rank and need. This professionalization has made them harder to destroy. You can arrest the generals, but new ones rise. You can break up street crews, but the structure rebuilds. As long as the ideology survives, as long as young men in Northern California believe in the cause, Nuestra Familia endures. For decades, Nuestra Familia was exclusively male. Women played supporting roles, smuggling contraband during visits, holding money, passing passing messages, but they weren't members. That's changing. In the 2000s and 2010s, women began forming their own norteña gangs. Crews with names like Northside Vandalias, Salinas Norteña Girls, Barrio Norte Chicas. They claimed red bandanas. They tagged 14 on walls. They fought sureñas, Southern California female gang members. Initially, Nuestra Familia leadership dismissed them. Women couldn't be made, couldn't take the blood oath. They could support, but not lead. But necessity changed that calculation. As law enforcement cracked down harder on male members, as surveillance intensified and phone calls were monitored, women became operationally crucial. They could visit prisoners without automatic suspicion. They could hold assets without immediate law enforcement attention. They could communicate more freely. Some women, through marriages to imprisoned members, through proving themselves in street operations, through unwavering loyalty, gained unprecedented influence. By 2015, some Nuestra Familia captains were reportedly women, not officially recognized in the traditional structure, but wielding real power, making decisions, ordering operations, collecting taxes. Law enforcement noticed. Arrests of female norteña gang members increased dramatically. Women charged with conspiracy, drug trafficking, even murder. The war that started with men was now consuming entire families. We focused on Nuestra Familia, but this is a war. And wars have two sides. The Mexican Mafia and their Sureño street soldiers didn't simply accept Nuestra Familia's rise. They fought back, viciously. In Southern California, Los Angeles, San Diego, Orange County, La M maintained iron control. Any norteño who ventured south of Bakersfield was taking his life in his hands. Stories circulated of norteños who'd moved to LA for work, for family, trying to leave gang life behind. They'd be spotted wearing red, or they'd slip and use northern slang, or someone from their past would recognize them. Within days, they'd be found dead. The Sureños had numbers. Southern California's population dwarfed the North's. In raw numbers, there were far more Sureño gang members than norteños. But Nuestra Familia had something. Sureños didn't. Unified command. See, while the Mexican Mafia controlled Southern California gangs, each street gang maintained more autonomy. 18th Street didn't always cooperate with Mara Salvatrucha. East LA gangs had beefs with South LA gangs. In the North, Nuestra Familia enforced unity. All norteño gangs, from Fresno to the Oregon border, answered to the same generals, followed the same rules, pursued the same objectives. That unity made them formidable despite smaller numbers. The war spread beyond California. In the 1990s and 2000s, as Mexican-American communities grew throughout the West, the Norte-Sur conflict went with them. Reno, Las Vegas, Portland, Denver. Anywhere significant populations of Northern and Southern California transplants existed, the war followed. Red versus blue. Versus theft. Blood in, blood out. Not everyone caught in this war chose to be. Maria Gonzalez, not her real name, lived in Salinas with her 2 sons. She worked double shifts at a cannery, trying to provide for her family after her husband was deported. Her oldest son, 16-year-old Carlos, was trying to stay out of trouble. He attended school. He worked part-time at a grocery store. He stayed home most nights. But he lived in a norteño neighborhood, and when Sureños from out of town drove through looking for targets, they didn't ask questions. Carlos was shot while walking home from work, killed in a drive-by that was meant to send a message to Norteños in the area. He wasn't in a gang. He'd never claimed Norte. But he was brown, he was young, he was in the wrong place. Maria's story isn't unique. Across Northern California, families have lost sons, brothers, fathers to this war. Some were gang members who knew the risks. Many others were simply civilians, caught in crossfire, mistaken for targets, or killed to prove a point. Children have been shot in their homes when bullets meant for someone else came through walls. Mothers have been widowed when their husbands, former gang members trying to go straight, were killed for perceived disrespect from years prior. The blood debt compounds across generations. A Sureño kills a Norteño. The Norteño's younger brother seeks revenge, killing a Sureño. That Sureño's cousin retaliates. And on and on. In some Salinas cemeteries, entire sections are filled with young men, ages 15 to 25, killed in gang violence. Red bandanas draped over headstones. Spray-painted Baltftirf tributes. Photographs of teenagers who never got to grow old. This is the true cost of the war that started over a stolen pair of shoes. The 2010s brought a revolution that Nuestra Familia's founders could never have imagined. Social media. Suddenly, gang members were documenting their entire lives online. Facebook profiles proclaiming Norte. Instagram photos throwing up gang signs. YouTube videos. Amateur rap songs calling out rivals by name, threatening violence, claiming territory. Law enforcement couldn't believe their luck. Gang members were creating evidence against themselves, posting it publicly, and tagging their locations. But social media also intensified the conflict. Disrespect that once might have stayed local now spread instantly. A Sureño in San Diego could post something mocking Norteños, and within hours, Norteños in Sacramento would see it, respond, escalate. Beefs that might have been resolved face-to-face instead festered online, growing more heated, more public, until violence became inevitable. And then there were the hits arranged through social media, encrypted apps, coded language, photos sent to identify targets, GPS coordinates to locate someone. In 2016, a Norteño gang member in Salinas was ordered to carry out a hit through a series of Instagram messages that used emojis and slang to mask the true meaning. Take care of that gardening problem with a gun emoji. The target's photo sent via Snapchat, visible for 10 seconds, then deleted. The murder was carried out within 24 hours. Law enforcement eventually cracked the code, but by then, social media had become another battlefield in the endless war. No organization lasts 60 years without internal conflict, and by the 2010s, cracks were appearing in Nuestra Familia's unity. The issue: control. Old generation generals, men who'd been in prison since the 1980s and 90s, were making decisions for streets they hadn't walked in decades. Young soldiers on the outside questioned whether these aging prisoners understood modern realities. Why were they paying taxes to men who'd never get out? Why follow orders from someone who didn't understand how technology had changed the game, how law enforcement tactics had evolved? In Fresno, some Norteño gangs began operating independently, keeping profits instead of sending them to prison leadership. In Stockton, younger members questioned the old blood oaths, suggesting they needed to adapt or die. Nuestra Familia's response was predictable: violence. Several young gang members who'd advocated for independence were greenlit. Some were beaten, others killed. The message was clear. You don't question the structure. You don't keep what belongs to the family. But this created a new problem. Every time NF killed one of its own for insubordination, other young members took note. Fear is a tool, but it's also a wedge. By 2018, some law enforcement analysts believed Nuestra Familia was fracturing, not collapsing, but splintering into semi-autonomous factions that claimed the name and ideology, but operated with increasing independence. Other analysts disagreed, arguing that this apparent fracturing was actually strategic evolution, allowing the organization to become more decentralized and thus harder to destroy. The truth? Probably somewhere in between. Pelican Bay State Prison, California's supermax facility, built in 1989 specifically to house the state's most dangerous inmates. This is where many Nuestra Familia generals reside, in the Security Housing Unit, the SHU, concrete and steel and isolation. Imagine spending decades in a cell smaller than most people's bathrooms. No human touch, no face-to-face conversations. Years, sometimes decades, without seeing trees, feeling rain, hearing birds. The psychological toll is devastating. Inmates in long-term isolation develop hallucinations, anxiety disorders, depression, suicidal ideation. The United Nations has classified prolonged solitary confinement as torture. But for Nuestra Familia generals, the SHU is also a throne room. From these cells, they maintain authority. They communicate through lawyers, through kites, through codes tapped on walls. They make decisions that ripple through communities hundreds of miles away. A general in the SHU sends word through a corrupt guard. That message reaches a captain in general population. The captain sends it to contacts on the outside. Within days, someone in Salinas receives orders that originated in a solitary cell in Pelican Bay. It's a perverse kind of power, wielding influence while locked in a box, commanding an empire while completely isolated. But it speaks to the strength of the ideology, the structure, the fear. People follow orders from men they've never met, serving life sentences they'll never escape, because the alternative is worse. Because breaking the blood oath means death. Because Nuestra Familia's reach extends everywhere, even into supposed safety. Not everyone has given up on peace. Over the years, various groups have attempted to broker truces between Norte and Sur. Community activists, former gang members turned interventionists, religious leaders, even some politicians. In 2012, a series of meetings were held in Salinas, bringing together former Norteño and Sureño gang members. The goal? Establish a ceasefire, at least in certain neighborhoods. Create safe zones for families. Stop the cycle. For a few months, it seemed to work. Violence in those neighborhoods dropped significantly. Kids played outside without their parents, fearing stray bullets. Then a young Norteño was shot by Sureños from out of town who hadn't gotten the message, or didn't care. Retaliation followed. The ceasefire collapsed. The problem with peace is that it requires universal buy-in. And in a war spanning thousands of miles, involving thousands of participants across multiple states and countless neighborhoods, getting everyone to agree is nearly impossible. Moreover, Nuestra Familia and Mexican Mafia leadership in prison have little incentive for peace. The conflict maintains their relevance, their power, their control. Without the war, why would young gang members pay taxes to prisoners they'll never meet? Some intervention programs have had limited success. Individual gang members have been convinced to leave the life, to stop claiming, to move away and start over. But the structure remains. The ideology persists. And every year, new recruits, 14, 15, 16 years old, join, believing they're part of something meaningful, not realizing they're entering a war that has no end. Parallel to the street war, another battle has raged in courtrooms across California. Nuestra Familia members and their attorneys have challenged everything from gang enhancements to RICO statutes to the conditions in the SHU. Defense attorneys argue that gang enhancements, additional years added to sentences for gang affiliation, are applied too broadly, sometimes based on nothing more than living in certain neighborhoods or wearing certain colors. They argue that RICO laws, designed to fight the mafia, sweep too wide, holding people responsible for crimes they didn't personally commit, simply because they're part of an organization. And they've challenged the SHU itself, arguing that decades in solitary confinement constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, that it destroys mental health without serving legitimate penological purposes. Some of these arguments have succeeded. In 2015, a settlement in a class action lawsuit led to reforms in California's use of solitary confinement. Prisoners can no longer be held in the SAU indefinitely based solely on gang affiliation. There must be specific behavioral violations. This has led to some Nuestra Familia members being released from isolation into general population, or even paroled. Prosecutors argue this makes communities less safe, that these are sophisticated criminals who manipulate the system. Defense attorneys counter that the system creates the very monsters it claims to fight, that throwing troubled young men into gladiator schools called prisons, then isolating them for decades, produces damaged, dangerous individuals who never had a chance at rehabilitation. It's a debate without easy answers, touching on fundamental questions about justice, punishment, and society's responsibility to address root causes of crime. Meet 3 generations of one Northern California family. Grandfather joined Nuestra Familia in the 1970s, spent 40 years in prison, died in Pelican Bay in 2015, never having held his grandchildren. Father became a Norteño in the 1990s, in and out of prison his entire adult life, currently serving 20 years for attempted murder. Son, 13 years old, lives with his aunt because his mother died of a drug overdose. Already wearing red, already talking about the cause, already on a path everyone around him recognizes but feels powerless to stop. This is what generational trauma looks like. The son doesn't remember his grandfather, never met him, barely knows his father, has visited him in prison a handful of times. But he knows the stories. He knows his family's history is intertwined with Nuestra Familia. He knows that claiming Norte means honoring his father, his grandfather, his heritage as he understands it. And he's 13 years old. In communities throughout Northern California, this pattern repeats. Families where gang involvement isn't aberrant. It's normal, expected, almost hereditary. Social workers and teachers see these kids coming from miles away. They know the signs, the older siblings in gangs, the imprisoned fathers, the poverty, the trauma, the anger. They try to intervene. After-school programs, mentorship, sports leagues, counseling. Sometimes it works. Sometimes a kid finds another path, another identity, another family in a coach or teacher or community leader. But sometimes, too often, it doesn't. The pull is too strong. The alternative's too weak. The need for belonging, for purpose, for protection too great. And another generation enters the war. After 6 decades, Nuestra Familia has taken on mythic proportions. Stories told and retold until they're indistinguishable from legend. The farm boys who stood up to the Mexican Mafia. The blood oath sealed in Soledad. The generals who run empires from solitary cells. The code of honor. The unbreakable loyalty. Some of it's true, some of it's exaggerated, some of it's complete fiction. The reality is more complex and less romantic than the legend. Yes, Nuestra Familia began as a response to oppression and disrespect. But it quickly became what it fought against, an organization that taxes, extorts, and murders its own community. Yes, there's structure and discipline, but there's also chaos, infighting, and petty violence. For every soldier following orders out of conviction, there's another doing it out of fear or habit, or because he doesn't know how to do anything else. Yes, some members are intelligent, strategic, committed to something larger than themselves, but many are damaged young men, products of broken systems, caught in cycles of violence they didn't create and can't escape. Former members who've left the life describe it differently than those still in. Some express pride in their time with NF, the brotherhood they found, the respect they earned. Others express deep regret, wishing they could take back years, wishing they'd made different choices. The truth about Nuestra Familia, like most truths, resists simple narratives. They're not purely victims or purely villains. They're humans, flawed, complex, shaped by circumstances while still bearing responsibility for choices. Of the founding members of Nuestra Familia, most are dead or serving life sentences. Robert Babo Sosa died in prison in 2007. Freddy Gonzalez, still incarcerated, unlikely to ever be released. The original generals who built the organization in the 1970s have been replaced by new generations. But the structure they created endures. Some mid-level members from the 1990s and 2000s are now being paroled, aging out, their sentences complete or reduced through various legal mechanisms. They return to communities that have changed dramatically. The streets they once controlled have new players. The technology is foreign. The world moved on while they were locked away. Some successfully reintegrate. They find work, reconnect with family, stay clean. They become advocates, warning young people away from the path they took. Others struggle. Decades in prison leave scars. They can't find employment with their records. Old connections pull them back. Within months, they're back in the life or back behind bars. And then, there are the Norteño street soldiers, thousands of them throughout Northern California. Some rise through the ranks. Most don't. They sell drugs on corners, collect small-time debts, do bids in county jail, cycle through the system. They're the foot soldiers of an empire that promises everything and delivers mostly pain. So where does this go? After 60 years, is there an end in sight? Law enforcement says they're winning. They point to successful prosecutions, to generals locked away for life, to street crews dismantled. But even they admit, you can't arrest your way out of this problem, as long as the conditions that create gang membership persist. Poverty, lack of opportunity, broken families, underfunded schools, communities devastated by incarceration. Young people will continue joining. As long as prison remains a brutal, dehumanizing experience where survival often requires affiliation. Inmates will continue organizing for protection. As long as the ideology persists, the narrative of Northern pride, resistance to disrespect, loyalty to family, Nuestra Familia will continue recruiting. Some criminologists predict the organization will eventually collapse under its own weight, splintering into rival factions that war with each other. Others believe it will evolve, become less visible but more sophisticated, adapting to law enforcement pressure the way organized crime has always adapted. Still others think we're asking the wrong question. Maybe Nuestra Familia doesn't end. Maybe it transforms. Maybe in 50 years, there's still an organization claiming that name, bearing those symbols, invoking that history, even if it looks nothing like what the founders created. What's certain is this. The war between Norte and Sur continues. Every week, somewhere in California, someone is beaten, stabbed, or shot because of colors they wear, neighborhoods they claim, loyalties they profess. The body count rises. The families grieve. The prisons fill. And it all traces back to a single moment in 1968, when humiliation turned to violence, and violence turned to war. Let's return to where we began. Soledad Prison. September 1968. A pair of stolen boots. It's easy to say the war wasn't really about shoes, that it was about respect, identity, resistance to oppression, that the shoes were just a spark waiting for tinder. And that's true. But it's also true that it was about shoes, because sometimes the smallest things, the most mundane objects, become vessels for larger conflicts. A pair of boots becomes a symbol of dignity denied. Taking them becomes an assertion of power. Fighting for them becomes a stand for something greater than leather and laces. That inmate who stole those boots probably never imagined he was lighting a fuse. The man who killed him probably thought it would end there. One debt paid, one score settled. Neither could have known they were creating a legend that would shape California for generations. Today, 60 years later, most Nuestra Familia members have never heard the full story of those boots. The details have been lost, buried under decades of violence and mythology. But they know the essence. That Nuestra Familia began when Northern inmates refused to accept disrespect. That their founders chose to fight rather than submit. That the organization was born from a single act of defiance. The original pair of boots is long gone, lost to time. But their legacy remains, written in blood across California's prisons and streets. Thousands dead, tens of thousands incarcerated, communities traumatized, families destroyed, all from a stolen pair of shoes. This is the story of Nuestra Familia, our family. Born from humiliation, forged in blood, sustained by ideology and violence in equal measure. It's a story about identity and belonging, about the human need for protection and purpose, about how quickly violence begets violence until no one remembers what started the cycle. It's a story about California, its divided geography, its complex racial dynamics, its prison system that warehouses rather than rehabilitates. And it's a story that isn't over. Right now, in prisons across California, norteños and sureños, i.e. other across yards, waiting for the next spark, the next disrespect, the next excuse to continue a war that has consumed 3 generations. Right now, in neighborhoods throughout Northern California, 13-year-old boys are making choices, joining, claiming, stepping onto paths that lead to prison or death. Right now, in courtrooms and law enforcement agencies, People are trying to break the cycle, to intervene, to offer alternatives. Will they succeed? Can 60 years of bloodshed finally end? Or will this war continue for another 60, passing from generation to generation like a bitter inheritance? The answer depends on us, on whether we're willing to address the root causes of gang involvement, to see the humanity in people we've been taught to fear, to break cycles of poverty and incarceration that make gang membership seem like the only viable option. Until then, the war continues. Norte versus Sur, red versus blue, our family versus theirs, all because of a stolen pair of shoes. You've been listening to American Gang War. This has been the story of Nuestra Familia, a 60-year conflict that began with humiliation and became an empire of blood. Remember the fallen, question the system, and maybe, just maybe, choose a different path. This documentary was based on extensive research, including court documents, law enforcement records, academic studies, and interviews with former gang members, corrections officials, and community activists. The names of some individuals were changed to protect privacy and safety. If you or someone you know is trying to leave gang life, resources are available. Organizations like Homeboy Industries, Communities United for Restorative Youth Justice, and the California Violence Intervention Program provide support for those seeking a way out. For families affected by gang violence, grief counseling and support groups exist throughout California. You are not alone. This program does not glorify gang life. It seeks to understand how and why these organizations form, persist, and damage communities, in hopes that understanding can lead to prevention and healing. Special acknowledgement to the communities of Salinas, Fresno, San Jose, and throughout Northern California who live with the daily reality of this conflict. Your resilience and hope for a better future inspired this work. To the victims, those killed, those incarcerated, those traumatized, your stories matter. You are more than statistics in a war you didn't choose. And to the young people listening, you have choices. The path isn't predetermined. There are people who will help. There is life beyond the war. Thank you for listening to American Gang War.